Serial Box presents Remade. Season 2, Episode 13, Actus Reus. Written by Matthew Cody. Narrated by Greg Tremblay. We kill him. Holden watched their faces as his words sunk in. Friends like Loki and Nevaeh, rivals like Inez, the quieter ones like Sebastian and Amelia, who were still little more than strangers after all this time. Let it register. See that I mean it. But then there was Saya, his friend and his connection to a lost life. The Holden he used to be. The Holden who would never have contemplated ending another person's life. Saya had known that Holden, even if she hadn't known him well. But this ruined Earth had changed everyone. Whoa, man. Loki glanced over his shoulder. You mean like just out and out murder him? He deserves to be executed. For the murder of Umta. Loki let out a low whistle. Definitely not what I was expecting you to say. Saya stepped forward. That's because he doesn't know what he's saying. Holden, you're in shock. You're grieving. We all are. Now's not the time to make snap decisions about life and death. Holden rubbed his temples. This was the argument he and Saya had been having all day, in fierce whispers while the rest weren't around. He'd hoped she'd come to see that this was the only way forward. Umta had meant as much to her as to Holden, and if anyone would have wanted vengeance for her death, Holden thought it would have been her. But Saya's dad had been a cop, and it turned out that a cop's daughter wasn't one for execution without trial, even in a world gone mad. Too bad. This would have been easier with her on his side, but it didn't change things. Cole had murdered Umta right before Holden's eyes. Would have killed him, too, if she hadn't stopped him. Cole was too dangerous to let live. Calmly, Holden looked over the others assembled around the camp. Umta's funeral was over, and now they would start packing up, getting ready to move out. Some yards away, there was a different sort of camp, Jingwei and her caretakers, or keepers, as they'd started calling them. Keepers are the good ones, she said, as if her word were enough. This Jingwei, remade for a second time and with a band of robots at her beck and call, was a big enough worry. They didn't need a murderer like Cole to look after as well. Maybe I am in shock, said Holden, loud enough that everyone could hear. Why aren't the rest of you? One of our own turned against us. Holden noticed a few people glance toward Cole. They'd untied him from the keeper and then retied him to a tree away from the rest of the group. This isn't just about revenge, said Holden. This is about survival. We have to travel light and fast. And just where the hell are we going this time? Said Gabe. You all keep talking about some door. What if that turns out like Arcadia, like Oz? Shit, when are we going to stop running? We don't have time for this, Gabe, snapped Holden. Oz's brain is dead, and his systems are shutting down one by one. I don't know about you, but I'm not crazy about the idea of making my home over a fusion reactor that might start to fail any day. Holden sighed. And no matter where we go, Cole's a threat. He's not one of us anymore. Nevaeh spoke up, as Holden expected she would. That's not... Look, Oz screwed with our minds in there. Messed Cole up somehow, but he's not some psychopath. To Holden's surprise, it was Inez who rebutted her. You know that for sure? I mean, none of us knew jack about one another before waking up here. She looked at Holden and Saya. Well, most of us anyway. What do we really know about Cole? Maybe that whole farm boy thing is just an act. Maybe he's done shit like this before. He hasn't, said Nevaeh. You don't know that, said Inez. Then she leveled her gaze at Holden. I agree we can't take him along. But I'm not down with murder either. I say, we leave him behind. Liked to press her cheek against the cool metal floor and listen to the station hum to her. The sound calmed her, like the low purr her own had used on her when she was young, like the one used to sing to her sons, Mok and Luk. Most of the time, those memories dug at her heart like a worm worrying an apple. But when she listened to the station, the memories hurt less. The pain never went away, but the panic receded. So would lie on the floor for hours like that, purring along with the station, humming along with its tuneless song. The caretakers gave her full roam of the station these days, and when she wasn't listening, she explored the service shafts and twisting tunnels. She avoided the observation rooms because looking down on Earth below gave her vertigo. Back when they'd first woken her, she'd tried to attack the planet through the glass. In her dumb, animalistic terror, she'd thought to try to kill it. Her favorite place was the reservoir. Lamps on the bottom of the lake cast shimmering lights against the walls, like the brilliant night skylights of blue and green she remembered as a child, back before the great winter drove her tribe south. And it was always peaceful in the reservoir, the water cool and clear. One of the few joys of being remade, the caretakers had taught her how to swim. She swam the length of the reservoir and sometimes dove all the way to the bottom, where she'd hold her breath and let the roar of silence fill her ears. When the need to breathe grew too great, she'd launch herself to the surface again. Despite her grief, never once considered staying on the bottom. After a lifetime spent fighting to live, the habit was far too ingrained. Lived, and the reservoir became her refuge, her private lake floating high above the clouds. Moisture reclamation technology used to maintain the hydroponic gardens. The words came unbidden to her brain, as words always did these days. When, wondered, had she started thinking in English? Was it when she'd run out of words in her own pitifully limited language for the wondrous things she saw? Even now, the caretaker's programming constantly uploaded new knowledge, and it was always running in the background of her brain. But knowing the name of something and knowing how that something worked were very different. The caretakers could fill her head with words, but they couldn't carve new neural pathways that would make her truly understand. So let the words come. Then she swept most of them into the dustpan of her mind, ignored and discarded like so much litter. The hum of the station, the beauty of her lake, these things sustained her through her grief. But as the months passed, began to experience an entirely new kind of hurt. For the first time in her life, she felt purposeless. Life until then had been about survival, first her own and eventually the survival of her sons. Now her sons were gone, dead these many millions of years, and physically, wanted for nothing. Boredom was too weak a word for what she felt. This was an existential hurt. It led to questions she'd never before thought to ask. Why am I here? The caretakers never answered. Not directly. Most of these caretakers couldn't talk because they'd been born, designed that way. Some, though, had had their vocalizers torn out long ago in a battle with others of their kind. For those caretakers, tearing out the vocalizers was a kind of ritual, an act of rebellion aimed at the human masters who'd created them and then abandoned them. Those who resisted had been forced to comply. But the lack of speech wasn't the largest impediment to communicating with the machines. It was their alienness. The caretakers had long ago stopped thinking as their human programmers had envisioned. They had evolved. Still, images or phrases that felt important would sometimes drift out of the constant data download. She knew that she was not the first to be remade, but she was the first to live through the process. And she knew that the technology used hadn't been designed for such a purpose, and therefore it made remaking difficult and dangerous. The caretakers labored constantly at improving their prized remaking machine, the portal. They'd only allowed a glance at it, an impossible, shimmering hole floating in midair. What they'd done to remake had taken tremendous power and nearly wrecked the machine in the process. The hole had almost closed for good. Had been a test, and what they were intending next was something even bigger, something that required all their focus. The day it finally happened, everything changed. Even "God damn it, just hold on!" Gabe shouted. It got everyone's attention, which was good, because in all the yelling, Holden could barely think. As they quieted down, Gabe kept on talking. "I'm going to make this real clear. If anyone touches Cole without us giving him some kind of trial or anything, I'm gone." May put her hand on his arm. "Gabe," but he cut her off, brushing her hand aside. "Seriously, I won't be a part of it." She crossed her arms. "If you let me finish, I was going to say I'm with you." "Oh." May let out an exasperated sigh as she faced the group. "Gabe's right. I'm sorry, Holden, you say that Cole murdered in cold blood, but we don't even know all the facts. Right now, it's your word against his." She looked over at Cole in the distance, who had his head down. "And he's not talking." "That's because he knows what he did," said Holden. "You want facts? How about the fact that he put a hole in Umta's chest?" May winced. "I'm not saying he didn't do it. I'm not even saying he doesn't deserve to die, strictly speaking. I'm saying we aren't prepared for that. This might be a really important moment for us, because if we really are the only people left on Earth, then what we do now matters." Loath as he was to admit it, Holden knew what she said made sense. The others thought so too, he could tell. Loki wouldn't make eye contact with Holden, and even Inez had softened her posture. She didn't look quite so ready to deck someone anymore. "Fine," he said at last. "We banish him, like Inez suggested." "But that's basically sentencing him to death anyway," said Nevaeh. "He won't last out there. You all know it's true." May thought for a moment. "The way I see it, we have only two options, Nevaeh. We take him along with us, or we leave him behind. We should vote, but not before presenting arguments, witness testimony. This is basically a sentencing hearing, right? I mean, Cole's not denying anything, so the job now is deciding what to do about it." Nevaeh turned away and shook her head. "We should call it what it is. We're voting on whether he lives or dies." "Nevaeh's got a point," said Loki. "The vote could get ugly." "Then we do it anonymously. We appoint one person to count the votes, someone who can be impartial." "And who's that going to be?" asked Holden. "How are we going to find someone like that around here?" "I'll do it." Holden turned to see Jingwei walking toward them. "Sorry," she said, "but it's hard not to overhear with all the shouting." "Look," said Holden, "no offense, but this isn't really your business." Jingwei shrugged. "That's why I'm offering to help. I don't know you, not really, or or Cole. You've all said it before, I'm not the Jingwei you knew, so I'll do it." Loki looked skeptical, but Sunita nodded. "She's right. It makes sense." Holden could almost hear scoffing at all this. She understood concepts like democracy and the right to a fair trial, but that didn't mean she believed in them. A strong leader would have killed Cole himself and been done with it. But that was the thing, wasn't it? This was their moment to prove they weren't savages. Neither were they cold machines like the caretakers. "All right," said Holden. "We do this your way. But after the arguments have been heard, after we've voted, everyone promises to go along with what the majority decides. Do we agree?" One by one, everyone nodded. "Okay," said Holden. "How do we start this?" Jingwei walked over and took a seat where she could watch both Holden and Cole. "Start by telling us what happened." People. That was what the caretakers had been working on all this time. A group of young people, remade just like Umta. No, not just like her. These were different. A later species of humanity, but Umta didn't care. They were people. It hadn't gone perfectly, however, and at least one of them was in serious distress. Umta edged her way into the sterile white room where two caretakers loomed over a young man who'd been laid out on a table. They stuck him with needles, wiring him up to machines that glowed and beeped. The boy went rigid, his body suddenly racked with convulsions as his eyes popped open. Umta knew the look of terror as he gazed up into the machine's faceted eyes. He screamed, but the caretakers went about their work. One of them plunged another needle into his neck. Umta pushed her way past the machines and took the boy's hand. He was crying now, mumbling apologies for something over and over again, delirious. "He's awake," said Umta to the caretakers. "You shouldn't do this to him when he's awake. It hurts him. It hurts him." The boy opened his mouth to cry out, but a caretaker jabbed another needle into his throat. The boy's convulsions stopped as he froze in place. But Umta could tell by the look in his eyes that he could feel everything. They'd paralyzed him so they could continue working to save him. But he was still conscious. Caretakers didn't understand pain. Umta fumbled around the medical tray for a syringe, one they'd used before on another girl who'd woken too soon. The one they'd used on Umta in the early days when she panicked and raged against her new existence, when she'd tried to kill the earth. Gently, she inserted the tiny needle into the boy's arm and pushed down the plunger. She laid a heavy hand on his forehead and whispered, "Go back to sleep. We'll wake you when it's over." Umta hummed to the boy until his eyes fluttered and then finally closed, and the caretakers continued with their work to save his life. Later, Umta sat on the edge of her lake and studied her reflection in the water. Not so different from these new people, but different enough. What would they think of her? Foolish that she should feel nervous now, after all she'd been through. But that was what time did to you when you had too much of it on your hands. It gave you cause to worry. She didn't hear the caretaker enter the reservoir chamber. The machines could be oddly quiet when they wanted to be. But she noticed the slight ripple on the water's surface as a door shut nearby. It was one of the simpler ones, a black maintenance model that reminded Umta of a spider, but acted more like the wolfhounds that had sometimes followed her tribe, looking for scraps. For some reason, she'd taken a liking to it, and it to her. It was an odd machine, and that was what Umta named it. Odd. Odd held a neatly folded red jumpsuit in its pinchers. "I'm not wearing that." The caretakers had tried to get Umta to wear clothing like this before, but the fabric made her skin itch. Odd dropped the clothing onto the floor, but it didn't leave. Finally, Umta grunted in frustration, but got to her feet nonetheless. Odd would wait there all day until she did what it wanted. It waited patiently by the door as Umta dressed. "Come with you?" she asked. Odd edged toward the door. "Lead," she said, and followed the little caretaker. It led her through the corridors to a closed hatch door. Again, Odd sat outside and waited. "What?" Umta snapped. She was short of patience today. Odd tapped on the door, twice. "Fine." Umta turned the wheel handle, causing a hissing sound as hydraulic hinges opened the 200-pound titanium door. So many words floated through Umta's head. So many useless words. Sitting upright on a slab was a boy, not the one Umta had helped during the operation, but a younger boy, with sandy brown hair and freckles. He was dressed in a jumpsuit similar to Umta's. He turned to look as the door opened. "Hello? Is someone there?" Umta had the sudden urge to flee, to run away and hide back in her lake with the shimmering lights. "Hello," she said instead. The boy made a face at the sound of her voice, which, now that she'd heard his, sounded thick and guttural, even to her own ears. He couldn't hide the surprise on his face as she stepped into the light, and he got a good look at her features. Different, but not so different. "Where am I?" he asked, clearly terrified. "What's happening?" So this was the ultimate goal. Umta knew she was a test to see if the caretakers would be able to successfully remake these young people, but she'd often wondered why they'd bothered to keep her around after that. She was inconsequential to whatever plans the caretakers had for them, so why let her live? But seeing the fear in the boy's eyes, and knowing the many questions swirling around in his head, Umta finally understood. "I am Umta." "Thomas McCready," the boy answered. "Thomas, you are safe," she said. "I am here to help you." She had found her purpose. Jingwei appeared calm, serene even as she addressed the group. Holden was reminded of the old Jingwei, how she'd quickly emerged as a leader and how her leadership had, inadvertently, led to many deaths, including her own. Things were different now. In her absence, Holden had taken charge, and then Inez had come along. There wasn't room for another leader in this group, and so far Jingwei seemed to accept that. But there was no denying that she was still comfortable in the spotlight. "Let's hear arguments first, then we vote. Holden, do you want to talk first?" Since Umta's death, Holden had been holding on to his anger like a white-hot cinder clutched against his stomach. Now, as he looked over their faces, he tried to rekindle some of that heat, to make his cold-blooded decision easier for the good of everyone. It wasn't hard. All he had to do was think of Umta. Nevaeh was right. A vote for banishment was a vote for death. The rest of them just couldn't face it. "This might be the hardest decision we'll have to make," said Holden. "Like many of you, I thought of Cole as a friend. But here are the facts. He led Umta and me into a trap, then he shot her. I don't know if Oz warped his brain or if Cole really was capable of this all along. I don't think it matters. We could bring him with us, keep him tied up, hope that wherever we're going has the means to deal with him. Maybe a jail cell. Or we could forgive him, blame it all on Oz's manipulation. Both of those would be merciful. But I think it comes down to this. We don't have the luxury of mercy. Cole committed the greatest crime I can think of, and he deserves the greatest punishment. For everyone's safety. Call it banishment if that makes you feel better, but as long as Cole's around, he's a danger to everyone here." Sunita raised her hand. "And say we do this thing your way. Do we leave him tied to a tree? Give him food and water? If it makes you feel better, we'll untie him, give him what supplies we can spare. But no weapons." "This is ridiculous," said Nevaeh. "It's a farce." The group started grumbling again, but Jingwei called for order before it could get out of hand. "Let's do this one at a time. Nevaeh, do you want to say something?" "Just a question," said Nevaeh. "Is this about justice for Umta, or is it about vengeance?" "Both," answered Holden, simply. He was surprised at how easily the answer came. Of course it was about vengeance. To pretend otherwise was fiction. "Then we've already lost." Nevaeh looked directly at Holden. "I've watched this place change us, in good and bad ways, but this is something you won't be able to come back from, Holden. You'll be condemning a man to death." She walked over to stand next to Cole, who was still sitting with his head bowed, as if he refused to even acknowledge what was happening around him, as if these people, who'd been his friends, weren't arguing about whether to leave him to the weather, to the wild predators and caretakers. This defiance was part of the reason Holden found it so easy to argue against him. If Cole had begged for his life, or even if he'd hurled curses at them, it would have been harder to contemplate leaving him here. Those would have been human reactions, but this silence, it unnerved Holden. It made him afraid of what Cole might continue to be capable of. "Why doesn't Cole speak up?" asked Holden. "Nothing to say for himself? He won't even say why he did it." Nevaeh was silent, giving Cole the chance to talk, but he stayed quiet. "All right. I'll talk for him then," Nevaeh said. "Cole lost a wife and a son when he died, and I think he, more than any of us, was hoping to find a way back to them. While we were fighting to stay alive, he was fighting to go home. Holden, you said before that saw him raise the gun and that she tried to stop him." "That's right. What if he didn't mean to kill her? What if the gun went off by accident or—" "Stop it." Everyone turned to see Cole watching them. Nevaeh took a step toward him. "I'm trying to help you." "I never asked for your help." Cole stared at them, looking them all in the eyes. What Holden saw in that stare shocked him. No hate, no desperation. It was dead, an empty gaze. "You want me to talk, Holden? I want you to tell me why you did it." Cole laughed, as if why we do anything here matters. "Nevaeh said I lost my wife and my boy, but I didn't. I never had a family. None of us did. We're remakes of people who've been dead for centuries. We're as artificial as those robots over there. Fakes." "That's not an answer." Without warning, Cole leapt to his feet. Holden stumbled backward, but Cole's bonds held. "Do it!" He yanked at the bonds like a dog straining against its leash. "If you had the balls, you'd have done it already. Why are you all wasting your time with this bullshit? Get it over with." "Cole, please," said Nevaeh. "Shut the hell up." Cole collapsed to his knees in defeat. "Just stop talking, all of you. Please. Stop fucking talking." A beat passed. Silence. Holden looked at Jingwei, who slowly nodded. "I guess it's time to vote," she said. Breakfast consisted of water and protein bars, just like always. Thomas told her he liked the brown bars the best because they reminded him of the chocolate bars he'd eaten back home. Chocolate. There was a word had enjoyed learning, even if the bars all tasted the same to her. Today she would meet the others, and anxiety gnawed at Umta's stomach. Over the last few days, and Thomas had shared much. They'd become comfortable with each other. Today they sat in a room with soft furniture and plants fed internally by the reservoir. The caretakers were meticulous about maintaining the plants, while other parts of the station looked ready to fall apart. "When will they wake up?" Thomas asked around a mouthful of protein bar. "Now," answered "One by one. They will be confused, have questions." "They're going to be pretty disappointed when we don't have any answers." Thomas finished off his bar and tossed the wrapper onto the floor. After the initial shock had worn off, Thomas had fallen into a gloom that knew well. He'd told her of a girl he'd loved, and about his parents and the family dog. All of that was gone now because when they looked out the observation windows, they knew one thing about the planet below. It wasn't the Earth either one of them remembered. Thomas's familiar coastlines had been erased by the rising sea, and Umta's clear skies were now littered with derelict satellites. The caretakers had been even less forthcoming with Thomas than they had with Umta. Perhaps they planned to communicate with Thomas in the way they'd upgraded Umta's brain, the constant data stream, but they'd been too busy thus far to bother. So they had largely left the explaining up to her, with her poor use of words. It frustrated Thomas that she had so little information about the station, and it frustrated him even more that she hadn't been more curious to find out. He grew angry, even petulant at times, just like her sons had. More! Umta unwrapped another bar and offered it to Thomas, but he shook his head. Do you think they'll let us go down? He asked. They can't keep us on the station forever. Umta thought about this. She was not sure going down to the planet's surface would be such a good idea. In her months aboard the station, she'd definitely gotten the feeling that the caretakers weren't just here because of their portal. They avoided the planet's surface for a reason. It made her think there was something down there worth fearing. There is an elevator, she said, testing the word aloud for the first time. Thomas was good about gently correcting her pronunciation from time to time. An elevator to where? The ground? I mean, aren't we pretty fucking high up? Yes, we are pretty fucking high up. Umta offered him the bar again. Eat. I'm full, thanks. He stood and stretched. Man, I wish they'd just tell us why we're here. Perhaps they will today. Yeah, and perhaps pigs can fly. Umta blinked at him. They cannot. Huh? Pigs cannot fly. They do not have wings. For some reason, it made Thomas laugh. No, that's just a hokey expression my grandfather used to say. It means something's impossible. Umta shrugged and took a bite of the protein bar. She did not let food go uneaten. Umta, out of the people waking up today, are there any like you? I mean, are any of them your people? But Umta shook her head. They are like you, and young like you. Why aren't there more of them? Have you tried asking again? You said you would try to get answers. And she had, but the machines had been ignoring her for days. They worked fast, caring for their newly remade kids, repairing what needed to be repaired so that they would awaken in perfect health. It was as if they were racing against some unknown deadline. Thomas could feel it in the air, too, a new urgency. Umta, He was cut off by a sudden jolt that sent them both reeling. For a moment, it felt like the whole station tilted, then righted itself. It was followed by an ominous rumble, like a peal of far-off thunder. Thomas looked around, concerned. What the hell was that? That didn't sound good. The lights flickered as Umta and Thomas made their way into the hall. Odd, the caretaker came scuttling toward them. It looked damaged. Its carapace was cracked and something sparked inside it, like a firefly blinking on and off. What is wrong? Asked Umta. In response, Umta was assaulted with a stream of images, chaotic, incomprehensible at first, but more and more a single scene kept repeating itself. In it, a large caretaker, unlike any Umta had seen previously, tore an inner door off its hinges. The robot had replaced its mechanical digits with rusty blades, and it wore some kind of animal carcass across its metal chest. This caretaker bore down on two smaller maintenance units and, with its powerful limbs, tore them to pieces. Then it tossed the remains aside. The stream of information ended, leaving behind a dizzying headache. Thomas caught Umta as she swooned. What's happening? He asked, his worried gaze flicking between Odd and Umta. But Umta understood Odd's message clearly now. They were under attack. It was to be a secret ballot. May tore tiny pieces of two different colors of fabric. The green was scavenged from a sanctuary blanket, the red from one of the old jumpsuits. Each person got one of each. A green vote meant Cole stayed. Red meant his banishment and likely death. Jingwei abstained from the vote altogether since she would be doing the counting. Holden noticed that sometime during the arguing, Jingwei's keepers had turned around to watch. At rest, the machines were absolutely still. Fidgeting, it seemed, was a human trait. It only added to their alienness, though, to see them standing like statues, observing them, maybe even judging them. These keepers professed to value humanity, claimed to have kept their original purpose to serve and care for their masters. But as the last people on Earth voted on whether or not to banish one of their own, Holden wondered what the Keepers thought of them now. "Holden." Jingwei was standing next to him. The truth was he avoided looking at her when he could. Too often she reminded him of the other Jingwei, lying on the ground with her face half burned off. "Here," she said, handing him a green cloth and a red. "Huh." He turned the pieces of cloth over in his fingers. The red one had a grease stain on it. "Are your friends watching all this?" Jingwei closed her eyes and cocked her head as if listening. "If the Keepers have thoughts about it, they aren't sharing right now." "What's it like when they talk to you?" "I wouldn't call it talking, it's more like—" She paused as she searched for the right word. "It's more like—" She paused as she searched for the right word. "It's more like flipping through stations on a car radio when you're on a road trip. Mostly static, a lot of garbage, but every now and then you get a song you recognize." Holden let out a tired laugh. "Sorry, it's just—" He sighed. "This has been one hell of a road trip." "Yeah." "Well, we'd better get to it. No use stalling." The group gathered in a circle, and Jingwei stood in the center and held out a backpack. "Choose your vote and put it inside. Green he stays, red he goes." One by one, the others cast their votes. Seiya and Nevaeh didn't hesitate. Everyone knew what they wanted. But Inez was next, and as she voted, she glanced at Seiya. They were on opposite sides of this issue, and Holden wondered what kind of fights they were having when the others weren't looking. It was a strain on all of them, one that Holden hoped could be overcome. But justice had to be done first. As the voting continued, Holden forced himself to look at Cole. It seemed only right, considering Holden was about to cast a vote that was practically a death sentence. Holden was almost as still as the Keepers. Head bowed, he leaned against his tree. Holden still couldn't figure out why Cole hadn't argued for mercy. If anything, he was more antagonistic than ever. Belligerent. Maybe this was the real Cole. But that was hard to believe. Nevaeh trusted him. He and Holden hadn't ever really seen eye to eye, but there'd been times they'd laughed together. In hunts, they'd depended on each other, trusting each other with their lives. And there was Umta. In those final seconds before Cole had shot her, she'd talked to him. She'd told him about missing her own family, her boys. She had understood something about him that eluded Holden. She saw a weakness there, and pain, but also a fierce love, and she seemed to get through to him. Whatever cloud Oz had cast over Cole had seemed to lift in those last few seconds, and Cole's whole demeanor had changed. Holden had been sure Cole was going to drop the gun. Instead, "Wait," he said. "I want to ask Holden something." "Holden, the vote's almost done," said Jingwei. "You're at the last one." But Holden ignored her and walked over to face Cole. "Tell me one thing. When you lifted that gun, were you going to turn it on us? Or on yourself?" Cole slowly lifted his face to stare up at Holden. "You. All of you. I was going to kill each and every one of you in your sleep, and I'll do it the first chance I get, okay? That enough for you, you fucking pussy?" But the words were hollow. Holden watched Cole blink away stubborn tears. He couldn't raise his hands to wipe them. Umta knew. In those last moments, she knew exactly what Cole intended to do because she'd felt that same pain. When Cole had raised the gun, she'd tackled him not to save Holden, but because she was trying to save Cole. She'd given her life to save his. Holden took a deep breath, then slowly released it. "Okay." Holden turned his back on Cole and walked over to Jingwei. Pausing, he looked down at the pieces of cloth in his hand. He dropped the green one into the pack. The good news was that so far the attack had focused on the station's southern wing only. That meant the living quarters had been spared the fighting. And there was a clear path between those rooms and the space elevator that they could use to escape the failing station. Spent the next hour hurrying the confused young ones to the elevator in twos and threes. They were wide-eyed and afraid, these remade children. But there was no time to explain. They didn't know where they were or who was, but they could feel the station shaking around them, hear the explosions. When given a way off the station, even by a stranger, they took it. That left Thomas and the two still in the medical bays in the southern wing, a girl and the boy had helped during his surgery. Both were healed, but had yet to wake up, and when they did, it would be like waking in hell. Caretaker fought caretaker for every inch of those corridors. She found Thomas, cowering in his room, his hands over his ears to drown out the distant sounds of fighting. Laid a hand on the boy's shoulder, bony, like her son's shoulders had been. "Thomas, you must get off the station." His eyes were wide with fear, bordering on panic. "You said I could go down with you." "No, it is too dangerous. There are 2 more I need to rescue, but they are in the medical base, and I am afraid there is fighting there. You need to go down alone. The others will be waiting for you on the surface." But Thomas shook his head. "I don't want to go down there. The station is failing." Words were tumbling past her now. Life support compromised. Reactor meltdown. Threats alien to a hunter from the plains, but threats nonetheless. "You must escape. I will follow soon. I promise." She gently pushed him toward the hall. "Go now. Get to safety. You are strong. You can do this." Thomas took a breath to steady himself. "Okay, but I'll wait for you at the elevator." "No! You go. I will meet you down below." Just then, another explosion rocked the station, closer this time. There was no more use in talking. Turned her back on Thomas and hurried in the opposite direction. "Go," she called out one last time, and the boy finally turned and ran. Good. Would use the service shafts and hope that the fighting was limited to the main hallways. She was weaponless and alone, but Thomas would have only slowed her down. These new people, the children, were not used to fighting, but had fought every day of her life. Headed for the service ladder junction near the southern wing's entrance. She knew from experience that this led to the level 1 med lab where she'd find the girl. After that, she could take a shortcut through the reservoir to rescue the boy, then backtrack to the elevator. Assuming they were still alive. Still couldn't grasp the aim of these new, savage caretakers. Were they here for the children? For the portal? Perhaps this was some kind of tribal feud between caretakers only, and they'd leave the children alone. Perhaps pigs could fly. Knew she was taking a chance. She needed the boy and girl to be alive, or she would be stranded here. What she hadn't told Thomas was that the elevator was operated by a controller authorization lock, a glass screen that could read a human handprint. Human. Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal. The only way was leaving this station was with a human in tow. As she rounded the corner to the service junction, froze. The lights here were blown out and deep gouges scarred the walls. The floor was wet with some kind of oily fluid lying in pools amid metal chunks of machine. A fierce fight. A caretaker had died. But was it one of or one of them? The air stank with the smell of burning ozone. Whatever happened here, it hadn't happened that long ago. The ladder to the service shaft was at the far end, where the hallway was hidden in shadow. Considered doubling back. She could take the main corridor to Medical Bay 2. It was actually a straighter path to get there. But in Odd's frantic download of images, had clearly seen the enemy storming through that hall. There would be few places to hide, and feared she'd run straight into the bulk of their forces. She had to risk the service shaft, and hope that whatever had torn this caretaker apart was long gone. She crept forward, careful not to slip on the oily floor. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dark shadows, then continued gingerly, stepping between torn wires and shrapnel. Umta was almost to the ladder when she heard a screech erupt from somewhere down the hallway. It was horrible, an animalistic howl made by scraping metal. She turned to see a massive caretaker, twice as big as any she'd yet seen, standing in the hall. It was bulkier than the others, with mismatched metal plates welded onto its frame in odd places. A caretaker's severed head dangled from a loop around its neck like a fetish. Its single red eye flared like a torch when it spotted Umta. She'd expected such a massive creature to be slow, but it came at her with surprising speed. It used the walls and ceiling to propel itself, half scuttling, half leaping after its prey. Umta barely managed to roll out of the way of its first attack as it raked its serrated claws along the floor. There was nothing she could do against such a thing. The primitive part of Umta's brain, the ignorant creature she had once been, wanted to match its ferocity in tooth and claw. She wanted to fight until her teeth broke and her nails were torn and bloody, even as it ripped her apart. Thankfully, that part of Umta was no longer in control. The caretaker was huge, but its size gave Umta her only hope for escape. Rather than stand and fight, she dove beneath the thing's legs, sliding in the oil. It bent around to snatch her, but in doing so lost its footing on the slick floor. It stumbled, but did not fall. That was fine. That stumble bought Umta the precious few seconds she needed to climb up the ladder into the service shaft. Umta was a fast climber when she needed to be, and the shaft was no wider than 2 people abreast, far narrower than the caretaker. It tried grabbing her with a long, segmented limb, but Umta took the rungs 3 at a time until she was safely out of its reach. The machine screeched as it tore at the service shaft, but Umta kept climbing. When she reached a fork, she entered the crawl space to her right. Eventually, the caretaker's cries grew distant, then stopped altogether. She soon encountered another problem, however, as she found her way blocked by debris. The collapsed ceiling was scorched and blackened. The damage must have happened in the fighting. The medical bay was close, but if the service shaft was blocked, she'd have to go the rest of the way through open corridors. The first thing she noticed as she climbed down out of the service shaft was the dead caretaker slumped over a wide control panel. A single hole, the size of Umta's fist, showed where the back of its head had been blasted open. Umta recognized this one as one of the leaders, if caretakers truly had such things. Umta had named it the Scientist because it was constantly working on the portal or other incomprehensible projects, and because Umta liked how the word sounded. If the Scientist died here, then this place must have been important, but not as important as the 2 children that still needed rescuing. Umta started for the door, pausing only to search the Scientist for anything that could be used as a weapon. Sometimes the caretakers carried tools. It was heavy, an inert mass of metal. As she struggled to lift it off the control panel, the panel suddenly lit up, and a hologram flickered to life over Umta's head. It was a glowing continental map. Umta recognized none of it, of course, but the map seemed to point to a massive, landlocked body of water. Exodus! The word came unbidden to Umta's mouth. She shook her head, the way one would if suddenly hit in the face with an unexpected drop of rain. The drop turned into a deluge. Whatever machine the Scientist had been working on began to download a massive amount of data through the caretaker's link directly into Umta's brain. She saw a portal like the one the caretakers had on this station, only 50 times the size. A gleaming metal arch in the middle of an ocean. No, a lake. A lake the size of a small sea. Millions of people were being ferried through the portal on enormous hovercrafts. The images came faster, of armed robots watching over the portal, of a world of red sand and green trees glimpsed on the other side. The images became a blur, voices talking in Umta's mind, a call, a beacon, and a warning. Coordinates, schematics, it was all coming at her in such a rush that she felt her head might burst. It was terrifying, and it hurt. She screamed and pounded the control panel with her fists. At once, the hologram winked out of existence and the download stopped. It wasn't like before, where the constant data stream retreated into the background. The transmission was over, cut short before the message was fully received. It could have been important, but Umta would never know. It was too chaotic, a jumble of words and pictures that had already faded. She had smashed the console's controls, so even if she wanted to try to receive the message again, she couldn't. It didn't matter. The plans and plots of caretakers had nothing to do with surviving in the here and now. Umta gathered herself and slipped out into the hallway. Thankfully, it was empty. She found the medical bay just a few doors down. There, inside a sterile quarantine chamber, she found a girl huddled in the corner. Dark skin, black hair, delicate features, so different from Umta's broad nose, her heavy brow. But not so different. The girl looked up as the door opened. She'd been crying. Umta softened her voice as best she could and smiled. "My name is Umta. I am here to help you." They made sure they were out of Cole's earshot as Jingwei counted the votes. She held up each one for all to see. The first piece of cloth she pulled out of the bag was green. Another green. Red. Green. Red. 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 Holden began to get a sinking feeling in his stomach. Too many red votes. He'd argued his case too well. With Jingwei abstaining, there were 12 votes total. 5 green votes. 7 red. Even if Jingwei had been allowed to vote, even if she'd voted green, it wouldn't have mattered. "That's it, then," said Jingwei. "Cole's banished." Nevaeh started to cry, and Saya put her arms around her. Holden drifted away from the others and gazed up at the sky. There were times when the landscape could lead a person to forget that 1,000 years had passed. You could look out over the woods and valleys and imagine you were on a hike through a simple state park. You could expect to round a bend and find a rest stop, complete with redwood picnic tables and charcoal grills. But the sky never let you forget. City-sized space stations always loomed overhead, appearing cloud-white against the blue sky. It was a constant reminder to Holden that this was a new world they were living in, and the history they knew was ancient. But that didn't stop any of them from making the same old mistakes. "You did the right thing." Holden turned to see Inez walking toward him. "Look, I was raised Catholic," she said. "And while the church and I didn't agree on much, we agreed on the death penalty. Human life is sacred, I believed that. And now?" Inez took a deep breath. "A vote to banish Cole was a vote to kill Cole. We just dressed it up differently. But we do what we must to survive. One psycho could wipe us all out. Do the caretakers a favor. We gave him a chance to defend himself. We gave him a jury trial. This may not be blind justice, but it's the best we got." He thought about telling her right there that he'd voted no in the end. He thought about marching back to the others and shouting that he'd made a mistake, that Cole was only a danger to himself and not any of them. But somehow that seemed even crueler to Cole than banishment, so he nodded instead. "Who's gonna break the bad news?" she asked. "I have to," answered Holden. "I started this. This is my responsibility." For once, Inez didn't argue. They walked back to camp together. When Nevaeh saw them, she leapt to her feet. She probably hoped that Holden and Inez had changed their minds and were getting ready to make some kind of executive decision to spare Cole's life. Holden couldn't look at her. He thought he should say something to the group, but there really was nothing more to say. He turned to Inez. "Get them packed up and ready to go, would you? I'll go talk to Cole." Inez began calling out instructions. Holden heard her give everyone a job to do so that they wouldn't have to think about the decision they had just made, to leave one of their own behind. Smart of her, he thought. Holden took Loki aside. "I hate to ask this, but Could you help me gather some food and supplies for Cole? Loki nodded, but asked, We really going to do this? We voted. The decision's made. Loki stared at the ground. I voted to let him stay. The guy's fucked up in what he did to Umta, whether it was an accident or not, but I just can't imagine being out here all alone. Me too, Holden wanted to say. Everyone voted their conscience, Loki. This isn't on you. Holden began the long walk over to Cole's tree. His stomach churned, and for a moment he worried he might be sick. About time, said Cole as he saw Holden approach. But there wasn't any bitterness to it. None of the scorn he'd used before. He just sounded like a man honestly wanting to get this over with. The group has voted to banish you, said Holden. Do you want anything? You mean like a last meal with pals? Cole sighed. No, man. I don't want anything this world has to offer. You were right earlier, I want this. I'm not afraid of dying. Only one thing scares me now. What's that? Coming back. They stood there for a moment in silence. Holden, you should know something. This place you're headed. Oz told me about it. He called it the Gate. I'm not sure I'd trust anything he had to say. Cole shrugged. He said that the Gate is how the humans all left. Wherever they went, it was through there. I'm thinking that if everything Arcadia said was true, about us being here to bring humans back to this planet, then I guess that's the place to do it. If it really is some kind of door, then maybe everyone's on the other side, just waiting for us to knock. Anyway, Oz said it was important, so take that for what it's worth. Cole, why are you telling me this now? Holden was interrupted by a sudden commotion. Voices back at the camp, someone was shouting. Cole looked up, and his eyes went wide as he saw something over Holden's shoulder. The hell? Holden swung around, just in time to see Jingwei's keepers marching toward him. Loki and Inez came running, weapons trained on the robots even as Jingwei was shouting for them not to shoot. I fucking knew it, said Loki. Holden, get out of there. But Jingwei waved her arms and shouted, They're not attacking! Just wait! If they weren't attacking, then what were they doing marching straight for Holden and Cole? The line of robots stopped a few yards away. Then a single keeper, one of the big construction models, approached. Jingwei ran alongside it. Holden had his hand on his gun. What the hell's going on, Jingwei? She was out of breath. I don't know exactly. They're trying to tell me something. She closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. Slow down, she said to no one. I can't. The caretaker carefully stepped around Holden. It looked down at Cole, who stared back at it defiantly. Then the caretaker put itself between Holden and Cole. Oh my God, said Jingwei. I get it. I understand. What? Asked Holden. For Christ's sake, what do you understand? By this point, the others had joined them as well. They kept their distance, but Holden could see their worried faces out of the corner of his eye. Jingwei slowly shook her head. I'm sorry, but they won't let you do it. They won't let you send Cole off alone. They won't let us? Holden asked, incredulous. What the hell business is it of theirs? It's like impossible. Whoa, said Loki. This is some first law shit, right? Jingwei looked at him, confused. Asimov? Said Loki. Man, am I the only one who ever read a book? Robots are programmed not to kill or let a human being be killed. But Jingwei shook her head. It's not programming, it's a promise they made to take care of us. They're going to keep their promise. Holden took his hand off his gun. Jingwei, if we banish Cole, what are your friends going to do about it? It seems like they'll physically stop us. They seem pretty insistent. Holden turned to Inez. This is fucked up, she said. But what can we do? Jingwei, Holden started to say, then changed his mind. You know what? Screw this. He walked over and faced the big keeper. "I'm talking to you. We can't take him with us, so what are you going to do about it?" The keeper cocked its head at him. Jingwei stepped forward and watched the machine, as if she were trying to hear something too soft for the rest of their ears. A look of wonder came over her face. She explained to the group, "It's saying that it'll stay behind with Cole, as far as I can tell." "To guard him?" "No, to take care of him." Holden was stunned. Everyone seemed as shocked as he was. What should he do? Argue with the keepers? Thank them? These machines weren't trying to stop anyone from banishing Cole. They accepted the group's decision. They had let Holden and the others fumble towards some kind of justice, sort of like an adult watching kids argue over a toy and waiting to break it up until the last minute. It left a bad taste in Holden's mouth, but he wasn't important. There was only one person right now who really mattered. "Cole?" said Holden. But Cole just started to laugh. Or maybe he was crying. It was hard to tell anymore. This has been Remade, Season 2, Episode 13, Actus Reus. Written by Matthew Cody. Narrated by Greg Tremblay. Audio produced by Amanda Rose Smith. Musical theme by Amanda Rose Smith. Copyright 2018, Serial Box Publishing. Production copyright 2018, Serial Box Publishing.